Everybody, thank you for coming out for this event, and we're really happy to have this event. Here's the thing though. So, we have the Center for Ethics, which is putting on this public event. However, we also have other public events that come from our other centers. We have a Center for Public Policy Research. Dr. Van Shelton went over a lot of things that happened out of the Center for Ethics, but other stuff comes out of our Center for Public Policy Research. We also have a Center for Law and the Economy. Even more public events come out of there. There used to be this QR thing that you could click on and clicky click, and whatever you people do to see stuff that's on a QR. I don't know what that is, and I don't know how to use it's out there. I don't know how to use a QR anyway. But for those of you who do, please QR it and learn of all of the other things that are happening from the other center. The thing that has us here at Tulane is that we also have a master's program and a bachelor's program. Just by show of hands, how many bachelor's of political economy students do I have? Look at that. See, so these are all folks who are majoring in political economy through our bachelor's program. So there's a lot going on, and I hope that you find your experience here so wonderful that you'll want to engage in other activities. Normally, what I would do at this time is tell you, look, you're really going to be excited about the speaker today, and you're really going to enjoy this talk. I don't have to, because guess what? You're really going to enjoy the speaker today, and you're really going to enjoy this talk. So let me tell you a little bit about who we have here. We have Dr. Fabio Rojas, is the Virginia Roberts Professor of Sociology at Indiana University Bloomington. His work explores the intersection of organizational analysis with political sociology and is widely recognized for his writings on social movements, political change, and economic sociology. His book, From Black Power to Black Studies, How a Radical Social Movement Became an Academic Discipline, uses data from the Black Studies movement to show how social movements generate lasting organizational change. He also authored Party in the Streets, the Antiwar Movement and the Democratic Party after 9/11, and Theory for the Working Sociologist. Dr. Rojas is the co-editor of Context, Sociology for the Public, the official magazine of the American Sociological Association. His work has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, and the Academy of Management Journal. And he has written for the Washington Post, USA Today, and The Hill, among other outlets. So why don't you help me in welcoming Dr. Rojas, as he's going to really give us something inspiring. So,
Thank you very much. All right, so first, a small technical note. The clicker is that one over there for the PowerPoint.
the clicker for
All right.
PowerPoint.
So while they bring up the clicker, I will make one slight corrective. So thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm the former co-editor of Context. Context is the public outreach guidance for the American Sociological Association. Now, our new editors, they are fantastic, so please check that out at context.org. So I'm Fabio. I teach sociology at Indiana University. And the title of my talk today is The Need for Good Society Science. And let me start with a very small moment that I'm here at the area of my social class. And I always like to ask students, why did you take this class? Because sociology is a struggle to a lot of universities. It's had a tough time getting enrollment. So I always just like to ask people taking the first big class, why did you take this class? He said, your Center for Social Commons got a fun subtitle. The subtitle is Money, Sex, Health, and Happiness. So I teach a course that tries to play up inside of sociology. And then I asked, well, what was your previous experience? He said, I was never going to take any sociology course ever again after the last one And I said, what was the next one about? He said, poverty in Minnesota. He just couldn't take another course on poverty. He just meant why. So it's that kind of sentiment that I'm going to be pushing against and arguing against in this talk. All right, so there's going to be two major themes of the talk. I'm just going to tell you up front what's going to happen. First, I'm going to talk about the focus on social problems. This is an aspect of our intellectual culture that's very prominent in the academy. It's also very prominent in journalism and other areas of cultural life. In other words, when people do certain types of cultural and intellectual work, they're bummers. They just like to focus on just like really the worst stuff. And by the way, even though I'm living with other sociologists and economists and other academics, I'm a perpetrator as well. I've ran on HIV, Black Power, the Iraq War movement, and so forth. So I am a perpetrator of the problem that I now want to address. All right, number two, once you identify the problem, you should probably think about the solution. Now, the tendency to be a bummer in society is a hard thing to get rid of. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but I will suggest the beginning of an answer, and I call it good society science. I'm suggesting that we should collectively, as intellectuals and academics, think about a way of doing social science that is a corrective and balances it out, the focus on social problems. And that's the second half of the talk. All right, what does it mean to study social problems? It's kind of one of those you know it when you see it kind of issues. When you see it, it's immediately recognizable. And it's not specific to sociology or to me or to any of you. It's something that's broadly found in our culture. So for example, in economics, there's tons of writing on market failure. I've yet to see an economics department offer a course called Market Success. Doesn't happen. A number of popular economists right now, like Raj Chetty, who will appear later in this talk, love talking about economic inequality. They just can't stop talking about all the negative things. There's tons of research on labor market discrimination in all its different forms. By the way, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying, how much attention do we need to pay to it? Do we need more or less? Psychology famously has an entire field called abnormal psychology. Anybody here a psych major? All right, did you take normal psychology? No, because they don't do it. They're all freaks, right? So there's a little bit of a corrective. So I want to be completely honest. There is a movement called happiness psychology. And that's kind of one of the things that kind of inspired this talk. Could we do something like happiness psychology that will be applicable to the social sciences broadly rather than psychology specifically? And by the way, I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding is even then, they don't teach a bunch of courses on happiness psychology. It's still kind of a niche topic. Then, of course, my own beloved discipline, the one that trained me and gave me a really great living, sociology. We are the kings and queens of bummers. We're just really so bad at it. It's really incredible. We study poverty and inequality in all its forms. It's really a total drag. So I'm just listing these examples just to kind of sensitize you to the problem. I'm not saying that everybody studies the negative or that we shouldn't study it, but rather it's really popular, and maybe it's so popular that it's become unhealthy. So if you're a philosopher, and this is sponsored by the Center for Ethics, you always ask why. What's the real foundation of the claim? You may ask, is this focus on social problems itself a problem? Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's all right to be the bummer, okay? And the answer is, by itself, no. If you were to come up to me and say, Fabio, I want to write my dissertation on poverty, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, problems relating to migration and so forth, I would say that's actually great, right? And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, academic freedom. We believe that scholars should have some independence. If they really think poverty is the issue they can contribute to, they should do it. We trust academics to do good research. Also, it would be inaccurate to say that poverty doesn't exist, or racism doesn't exist, or sexism doesn't exist. They do exist, and there's a lot of empirical evidence produced by sociologists and others saying that these things are true. So as an abstract issue, I am not saying that we should back off on the study of inequality at all, or social problems. However, It is a problem if it's disproportionately represented in the discipline. So this is the issue. It's not about any individual researcher. It's about what the collective is producing as a product for the rest of society to consume. So we pay all these sociologists, and for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to pick on sociology because they're easy to pick on, and they will still love me after I pick on them because I'm one of them. But the point is, we produce this product, and it has issues if it's always negative. So what are the issues related to a really strong emphasis on social problems? I think there's two ones that really deserve quite a bit of attention. The first is empirical inaccuracy. So if you open up a sociology journal and all of the articles are on one topic, you would say, that's interesting, but is that really an accurate description of the real world? As a matter of the division of labor in the academy, is it good to allocate this much labor to these types of problems? So just to give you a sense of what it's like in sociology, I've actually counted it. If you look at our top two journals, like the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review, something like 2/3 of them deal with inequality defined broadly in some way. There are articles that talk about good stuff, but most of them don't, right? And if you were to say, is this what sociologists really think society is like? You would say that's probably empirically wrong, right? Inequality is real, but it's not everything. There's a lot of things that matter in life beyond differences in income or discrimination based on some status characteristic. Important, yes. Obsession, no. So it's just empirically inaccurate. There's a second issue I want to bring up, which is public image. If we relentlessly beat the drum of all that is negative and all that is bad, we look really bad. We sound like a bunch of whiners. If you want a very concrete example of this, a couple of years ago, there was a lawsuit against Walmart, the retailer, and I believe it was about gender discrimination. So the sociologists, the audience, they can remind me if I get the details wrong, but you know what's coming up. And in the litigation, sociologists were invited to give evidence on the reality and consequences of gender-based discrimination at work. So at first you might think, bravo, they're calling in the experts. But then John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, dismissed all of it and just said, that's just sociological gobbledygook. Could you imagine if he waved off a surgeon and said, well, that's just surgery talk, that's just lame, right? No, or a physicist, like, oh, that's just quark talk, it's not important. No, but we're at a point where public figures can openly disparage sociology because of the predictability and the bias of what comes from that field, okay? So these are my two claims about why a focus on social problems is itself problematic. It's just not accurate, and it creates public image problems. And to show you that I'm not making this stuff up, you may think I'm just a guy. I could be wrong. I'm a Popperian. I believe I can be falsified. So I got to show you some evidence showing you that this is real. So I just randomly clicked on the Center for Ethics website. You've probably seen the Center for Ethics website, right? Like it's here. And what did they choose to feature? Because I was invited to talk. What did they feature? Mass incarceration, humane policing, and I assume that's a corrective to police abuse. And number three, how we can restore fairness to the economic system. I'm assuming they assume it's already unfair. I didn't see a talk talking about how great the economic system is or successes. Okay, then as I was flying here yesterday on my social media feed, I saw this op-ed from the Washington Post, which was released just a couple of days ago, called Your Salted Caramel Mocha Latte is Destroying Society by Jacob Grigiel, a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America. And literally, this professor is literally saying that when you go to Starbucks and you start doom scrolling and drinking your latte, you are destroying society because you're destroying relationships, you're not engaging with other people, you're not making real friends, having real social contacts. So you look around our intellectual ecosystem and you see the negativity is all over the place. So you may say, Fabio, are you cherry picking? Is it the case that that maybe you just read the wrong Washington Post. Maybe it's the case it's not as bad as you think. Okay, let's start looking at some data. I'm not going to sit here for half an hour and go through every single discipline because it will vary from discipline to discipline, but I will pick on sociology because we're a really bad offender in this category, and it's always fun to knock on your friends once in a while. So I'm going to start dunking on them right now. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of pieces of evidence that indicate how deeply pessimistic sociologists are. The first, and I'll use sociology, and before I get to the data, I just want to define two terms I'm going to use throughout the rest of this talk. One is professional sociology. And this is a type of sociology that Michael Borway discussed in a very influential 2005 article about public sociology. He said there are different types of sociology you can do, and the type of sociology that's knowledge for knowledge's sake, he called professional sociology. So for example, if you call me up on the phone and you say, why did divorce rates in Kenya increase from 1972 to 1985? A demographer can sit down and crunch some numbers and give you some answers. And that doesn't depend on what they think about the state of the world, whether it's good or bad, or that they have a political chip on their shoulder to push. That's what Michael Borway called professional sociology. And in contrast to that, he talked about public sociology, activist sociology, or what I'm calling social problems research, that looks at dysfunctions or failures of the world and urges social change. And Michael had a very concise description of this. He said, we need this as a counterbalance to the forces of the world, like the forces of capitalism, the forces of state interest, the forces of inequality. And sociologists could play a role in changing the world by critiquing it and producing knowledge that can help people change things. And so right now, as of 2026, I would say that sociology has a very two-faced approach to the world. Sometimes when you approach sociologists, they say we're professional, other times that we're saying we're activists. So now I want to show you how much activism has become ingrained within the discipline. The first piece of data comes from a professor named Philip Cohen. I know you know Philip Cohen pretty well, sociologists. He is a professor of sociology, studies family and demography at the University of Maryland, and he got data on enrollment and memberships within the American Sociological Association. This is from his blog. He put it up for the public, for everybody to use. And what he did was he gathered data on sections. If you're not a card-carrying sociologist, a section is simply a subgroup. So if you're interested in, say, race and ethnicity, when you sign up, you just check that off and you pay $5 extra or $7 and you become part of that club. So those clubs over time can be tracked, and you can see whether they're going up or down. This is a little bit complicated to read, so I will narrate it for you. So basically 2002, 2012, 2022 tells you the raw numbers, okay? Then the first decade of data is represented by the first column to the right, and then the last column is recent data from the teens and the early 2020s. The orange and yellow figures show declines in membership. Blue shows an increase. So there was an increase overall in ASA membership, and that's reflected in the blue increases from that time period. But in more recent years, you see that everything has collapsed. Might not collapse, that's too strong a word, but has notably decreased. This is also consistent with what we know about data about membership from the American Sociological Association. There's been a bit of a decrease. But you notice that a few places did pretty well. Race, gender, and class increased 115 members. Inequality and poverty, 190 members. Then I think on the other part of this chart, there's one or two other small sections that got a small increase. So think about it this way. If you're looking at the demography, at the people who are doing sociology, there is a marked movement into fields that focus on social problems. And most other fields have seen a decline. So people are voting with their feet. You say, well, Fabio, maybe that's the average sociologist. Maybe the cool sociologists, the elite sociologists, the leaders are a little bit more chill. They're not so negative all the time. All right, exhibit number 2, elite publications. So every year, the American Sociological Association lists books or nominates a book or two for a Book of the Year award. And in presenting this data, I want to make it very clear that these are excellent pieces of scholarship. I am not claiming at all that these are poorly written books or they're inadequate in any scholarly sense. And I recommend that you read a lot of them. I've read a bunch of them, and they're very rewarding books. I recommend that you read them. But what I'm talking about is a skew in what elites in the ASA give attention to. 2025, work in a disconnected world. That's about social isolation and modern work. The crisis of Black masculinity and racial capitalism. I don't think that's a very happy book. Rossel Perennius, Unfree Migrant Domestic Work in Arab States. That's probably an understatement. She's essentially studying slavery and servitude. A lot of people are abused in that part of the world, and they're forced to work for other people in a de facto slavery situation. Okay? 2022, Redistributing the Poor, Jails and Hospitals. So that's another mass incarceration piece. Celeste Watkins Hayes, Remaking a Life, Women Living with AIDS, Confronting Inequality, and Tame Meadows, Trans Kids. Like I said, these are all excellent books, and they deserve the recognition they get. However, when you line them up in a row, there's a whole bunch of other topics that are just not present in this list. Yeah. They're like, well, Fabio, maybe the elites are out of control. That's just one book awards committee. Well, let's look at the organizational culture. The ASA is an organization with workers and a president that comes up with a theme for its annual convention. So when you go there and you walk in, there's a big banner, and it'll have say, welcome to the 2023 or 2024 ASA meeting. Our theme for the year is X. Let's look at recent themes. Reimagining the future work, maybe or maybe not a social problem, I'm not sure about that. But intersectional solidarities, communities of hope, justice, and joy. If you're not a sociologist, intersectionality theory is the perspective that says that we live in what they call, whoops, I think we lost, here you go, that we're living in a matrix of domination, which means overlapping forms of inequality. So in order to understand the social world, you have to understand how race, class, gender, and other forms of inequality overlap to create distinct social worlds for people to live in. So that's very much a social problems issue. The educative power of sociology. I went to that one. I don't quite know what the educative power of sociology is. I think that's kind of a weird word, so I'll just skip it. Bureaucracies of displacement, emancipatory sociology, power and resistance at work, social justice for a better world. So once again, you see the popularity of social problems approaches, not always the case, but often the case. So you may say, well, is this an argument for getting rid of social problems research? Once again, the answer is no. I firmly believe in the value of every piece of scholarship that I just reviewed. I think it's important. We have to do it. We should continue to do it. My issue is balance. So my argument is not about abolition. I don't want to get rid of it. I don't want to cut it down. That's not what this is about. It's about intellectual diversity and pluralism. Trying to come up with an intellectual space where a different mix of questions can be asked, and they can be valued, and they can be rewarding. And so if you think about it in detail, I think this position has a lot of intuition behind it. So number one, you want social problems. You want to study inequality. That'll be like medicine without illness. So there are people who say, why do sociologists study poverty at all? No, they've got to study it. Poverty is important. In the same way that a doctor who says you never get sick is a bad doctor. Just don't do it. I don't think that's right. But just as not everyone is sick, society is not a pile of problems. It's actually problems and solutions, and things getting better, in some cases in really drastic and dramatic ways. So my argument is that we need to accept social problems in professional sociology, as well as a new type of thinking, or a newish type of thinking that I would call good society sociology, or good society science. So in other words, in our discipline, in our associations and journals, we should encourage the study of problems, but we should also encourage the study of solutions, and we should also encourage kind of professional knowledge for knowledge's sake. All three forms of inquiry should really be able to exist in the same house. All right. So that's the first half of the talk, just to sensitize you to this problem, persuade you that I'm not crazy, I'm not seeing things. This is all just public information that I've pulled and put in this presentation. And then the second half is the so what. Okay, if any of you believe that this argument has any credibility at all, then the next question you have to ask is, what are you going to do about it? What should somebody do about it? What would a good society of science actually look like? Well, I think at a very basic level, any form of science or scholarly inquiry is going to have a couple of parts. And you have to just start laying them out one at a time. Number one, you need something to study. That's your topic. And I would say just start with goodness. Okay? That in a room of philosophers, raise your hand if you're a philosopher so I know who you are. I know you guys are going to fight me on this later because people argue about goodness all the time in philosophy, but we're not going to go down that road. We're going to take a very chill and mellow approach. We'll get to that in a second. But some version of goodness is what you have to start with. Then the main research question for good society science is to ask the question, in general, what social processes lead to goodness in whatever form that you define? So it's a really simple idea. Just go through the literature or do your own original research and start figuring out what are things that consistently appear when you look at goodness as a dependent variable in your study. Theoretically, what do you want to see? You want something that's broadly applicable. This criteria that I added was inspired by Stephen Brint's article in Theory and Society, where he said that social theory should be focused on what they call high leverage concepts. So social theory should be about coming up with an idea that's applicable to many different cases, okay? So you want some sort of social process that will influence goodness in this various guises. Then for methods, I'm not going to preach anything weird. I'm just going to say use your normal methods. Surveys, interviews, ethnography. Whatever it is that you do, you just now have a new dependent variable. So what is good? Philosophers, put your spears down. I'm not going to cause violence here. But rather than present a strict definition of good, I'm going to go through kind of a mellow, inductive approach to goodness and just say, what are some things that most human beings find really valuable? That's it. I'm not going to tell you what is good in some platonic sense. I'm not going to tell you what's good in the sense of like a covering law that has to cover all situations, but just to say, for most normal humans, what matters to them? I would say there's at least three things, and this is not exhaustive. This is just an initial suggestion. Number one, material wealth and not being in poverty. If any of you have been in poverty, you know how incredibly bad it sucks. Nobody ever said, I want to do that again. We see that as extremely valuable. Also, in terms of material wealth, we could argue about whether it's good to be materialistic or not, but most people enjoy having a nice house that doesn't have a leaky roof. They enjoy things like air conditioning. I bet that 99% of you have a cell phone that works incredibly well, allows you to do magic. That's material wealth. Number two, healthiness. Yes, once again, you could have some weird philosophical argument where you say, is it good to be unhealthy or to not exist or something like that? I'm just going to reject that and say most people who are sick don't want to be that way. And so the less of it that we have and the more life we have, that's generally good. Always exceptions. You can argue about terminally ill people or something, but healthiness is something that we really care about. And then number three, happiness and or life satisfaction. And so by happiness, I just simply mean the affective state that you have. Like, I had a great po' boy sandwich yesterday. It was amazing. I was happy for an hour. That's happiness. And by the way, psychologists and sociologists study happiness know that happiness often depends on how you measure it. So if you measure somebody at work, they'll be less happy than they are on the weekend. So it's not a specious example. But the point is, that's just a mental state we have about a kind of a short time slice. Also, psychologists remind us that life satisfaction in a broader sense is also important. That's not whether you had a good sandwich or whether you had a bad day at work or somebody broke up with you, but about when you look at your life and you go, yeah, that's not bad. For my time on earth, that's not a bad way to live my life. That's good. We call that life satisfaction. So I'm not claiming this is all of goodness, but I'm just claiming this is a decent start. And if you don't want to appear like a whiner or a loser in the intellectual landscape and you want to study stuff that people care about, this is not a bad way to go. So then you could ask, okay, what are some examples of things that might be part of a good society science? The first candidate that I want to talk about is connectedness. All right? There are a lot of ways you could define that, but let me give you the intuition. Something that a lot of sociologists and other social researchers have discovered is that connectedness seems to be very important for your life in many different ways. So when I was thinking about what could count as good society science, the very first thing that popped into my mind is connectedness, right? And if you want a technical definition, the way sociologists define it is they say, you're a node in the diagram, I'm a node in the diagram, we're friends now. There you go. We're now connected. My health is better, whose health is better, we're all good, right? And the way that this is often studied is that you map out who is connected to who in some group, and you say, well, people on the edge are less likely to have connections than people in the middle, right? People in the middle have very dense connections. For you sociologists out there, we could talk about the nitty-gritty of this science in more detail, but if you've never seen this before, this is the way sociologists map out relationships. And this is why you should major in sociology. This is really cool. But in general, we discover that people in the middle, like that guy right there, they tend to have much better lives than people who are on the edge. And in fact, one of the first pieces ever of network scholarship from the 1930s is a psychiatric study, which argued that people who had lots of connections had better outcomes in psychiatric treatment than people who were socially isolated. So what is the evidence? So once again, don't take my word for it. There's a big literature. Here's just a couple of examples I want to talk through. But there is a lot of evidence coming from sociology and other fields like medicine, psychiatry, and public health that social connections really help you live a good life, a really good life on many dimensions. The two I want to talk about are the Grand Study of Human Development. The book I'm going to draw from is George Phelan's book, and Somebody to Talk To, written by the sociologist Mario Louis Small. So the first book up there is called The Triumphs of Experience, and it is one of the most boring books because it's just a bunch of charts and graphs, but it's one of the most amazing books as well. It's a wonderful book to read. Because what they did at Harvard in about 1945 was they grabbed a bunch of freshmen at Harvard, then a control group of 17-year-old young men in Boston, and tracked them to age 70. So it was a longitudinal study of human development from your age as college students all the way till they passed on. It is mind-blowing when you think about it. And one of the things that they discover is that the quality of relationships correlates with living longer, the number of days that you're sick, being depressed at old age. It correlates with all this good stuff. And when they say a relationship, they don't mean your mom. Like your mom or your wife, they're required to like you. But if you develop a friendship with somebody who's not biologically related to you, it is highly correlated with all this good stuff, even at age 70. This blew my mind when I read it. And this actually shook me out of my own stupor. So I was the kind of person who would play video games, that would play Tetris or other video games at home all day. I was a Guitar Hero fanatic. But then I decided to go make friends as an older man. Literally, and I can tell you about it later if you really want to hear about it, but I actively cultivate social relationships. Mario Small has this wonderful book called Somebody to Talk To, How Social Networks Matter in Practice. It's a wonderful book, you should check it out, but he has a nice review at the beginning where he talks about the literature on networks and well-being. And one of the things he claims is that in the medical research, we know that there's a causal link between social relationships and health. So he cites one study, I believe it's of terminal patients, and the control group gets no instruction, and the treatment group, they're hooked up with friends to talk to. And even at the end of life, the people in the treatment group live a little longer. It's like, wow, just talking to people gives you a couple extra weeks or a couple months at the end of life. I'll take it. I'll take it. So networks are good for mental well-being. They're good for physical well-being. They seem to be a very integral part of your health beyond your genetics and your diet and your lifestyle and so forth. It turns out connections are also good for your bank account. There's also a lot of literature from management research, from economics, from other fields that show correlation between the people you know and your actual income. You're actually wealthier when you know more people. This is one example pulled from, I believe, Nature or Science. I can't remember. It's Nature, it says right there. Lead author, Raj Chetty, the economist. And basically, his research team pulled all this Facebook data, and they showed that the more connections you had, the more economic mobility you have. My favorite study is an old one from, I think, the 1980s or 90s by the management researcher Ron Burt. And if I say the word Rolodex, raise your hand if you know what a Rolodex is. Okay, I'm not going to explain it. So Rolodex just keeps track of how many people you know. So Ron Burt, this management professor, he actually does interviews with executives, and he asks them, show me in your Rolodex, how many people do you know? And the number of people in the Rolodex correlated with the hourly salary, even controlling for a number of years' work, level of education, gender, these other basic things. So we have evidence that not only is connectedness good for your physical and mental health, it's also good for your financial health. Truth be told, disclaimers, in some studies, the effect is not as strong as you might expect, so there is a little bit of mixed evidence there. But what I would say is that if you're thinking about good society science, this is a good candidate. Connectedness is a very basic feature of humanity that leads to goodness. Now, the next example I'm going to give you is a little bit more contentious. We'll talk about that for a few minutes before we wrap up. So I think the second example I'm going to use is economic liberalism. There's a lot of evidence that economic liberalism is good for you. And I find this to be interesting because most people, including sociologists, and maybe especially sociologists, do not agree with this basic point. So first, let me take a moment to tell you what economic liberalism is, and then give you some of the evidence behind this claim. So basically, when economists talk about economic liberalism or economic freedom or free markets, they usually mean an economy where the government does not regulate private property as much, right? So you can imagine a world where everything gets regulated and a world where zero is regulated. And a question that people had was, what's the correlation between the flexibility, openness, or liberalness of an economy and various social outcomes? So how do you study this? Well, the typical way that this is studied is that there's a research institute at Simon Fraser University. They go country by country, and then they just make a scale. So for example, can exchange rates between different currencies float freely, or is it fixed? Is the taxation level relatively high or relatively low? There's like all these things that they just check them off. And if you're a good social scientist, you know you can make a scale out of this. You can just make a number out of this. And then you could just ask, does this number, which is a rough guesstimate or estimate of how open an economy is, does it correlate with good stuff? Okay, well, at the very least, it correlates with reduced poverty. So one thing that's been found in study after study after study is that the higher you are in the economic freedom index, the higher the average GDP, and poverty rates also go down correspondingly. And if you want two really great historical examples, think about Korea, think about India after they liberalized their economies in the 80s and 90s. The number of people in abject poverty, and stratification researchers define that as not having enough calories per day, massively decreased. And so I live in a discipline where people tend to be very skeptical of markets or capitalism or economic freedom in some way. I say, I hear you, but these facts are very big and they're hard to avoid. But if you're thinking about what makes for a good society, this is worth thinking about. Another interesting fact is that GDP, which is one thing that correlates with economic freedom, correlates with life expectancy. So I couldn't find a chart that directly measures economic freedom with life expectancy, but economic freedom does correlate pretty well with GDP, so there's an indirect and a direct effect, if you're into that. And basically, the longer people live in your country, the more likely it is that your country has a high GDP. This is profound. This is not a high school statistics textbook fact. It's telling us something profound about the way the world is built. And countries that allow economic flexibility have longer lived populations with less poverty. That's a big fact. Then you may say, well, Fabio, you're claiming that it's always a good story. It's like, no, it's actually a little bit mixed. So for example, when I started looking up the research on health, well-being and happiness and life satisfaction, it's a little bit more of a mixed story. So the big person in this field is an economist named Christian Bjornskov. I never know how to pronounce the O with the slash in it, but I believe it's Bjornskov. And he's written a bunch of papers with other co-authors that just take various measures of social and mental well-being and correlates them with the Economic Freedom Index. And if you can just make a nice little table. So for example, life satisfaction is positive, homicide rates or crime is negative, emotional well-being, positive, mental health, mixed or indirect. And the way I read this data is that in an economy where you're allowed to kind of do whatever you want, to buy and sell, to build a business, tear it down, buy an apartment complex, get rid of it, that's going to have a lot of economic growth. And that means a lot of people are going to get out of poverty. But at the same time, it's a very turmoil-filled economy because going bankrupt is really disruptive. Losing your job, being laid off. If you're in a sector of the economy that's on its way out, then that will be something that will lead to at least short-term mental health issues. And we know that. This is a very well-established issue. So I present this not to say that this is a one-size-fits-all or that one social process leads to happiness in all cases, but we're now having an interesting conversation about what does and does not correlate with well-being. So that's my spiel for the day. I want to thank everybody for showing up. I want to thank Chad, who was very nice, who are hosting this, the Center for Ethics, and the university for hosting it. So thank you very much.
All right, so academics go for the negative, right? And they shouldn't. Let me start with the negative. I didn't like anything you just said. No, this is not true.
I like the fact that you're here.
Yes. Well, let me start with this question for you, right? Could it be the case that I can't see or get to the good because of the negative, and it's actually an impedance to wanting to talk more or to celebrate the goodness, which I can't actually have as a result of this? So if we could study this, figure out a way to remove it, we could actually more readily reach the positive, which we know is on the other side.
Yeah, so when you were raising this comment, I started thinking about poverty research. This is a big topic in sociology. And you could make the argument that we don't appreciate the good because there is poverty in the world, right? And I think my response to that is that I understand why an average person walking on the street might believe that, because the average person walking on the street has a normal human tendency to look at negative things. Psychologists actually call that negativity bias. So for example, if you say 4 people got out of poverty this year and 4 people got into poverty, people will just on the average look at the negative every time. They will not look at the other stuff. But we're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to be able to sift through the evidence and really give a comprehensive and well-balanced story about what is happening out there. And I would say that with the example of poverty being illustrative, that we can honestly say that poverty by many measures has declined historically. If you use the US Census definition, it has gone down from the 1950s to today, and it goes up and down with recessions. When there's a recession, it goes up, it goes down. But something like a third of the US population was, according to the US Census definition, in poverty in the 1950s. Now it's down to about 15 to 20%, depending on whether there's a recession here or not. Most people would say that's an incredible life-changing improvement for tens of millions of people. We should also recognize that for a lot of people, it's still pretty bad. And I think as academics, we should fight that bias and say, yes, there's negativity, it is pulling my attention, but because I'm well-trained, I look at both sides of the argument, I look at multiple types of data, I accept intellectual pluralism, where I understand the social problems and social progress have to be both part of the conversation, I can then start seeing that good stuff. That's our job.
Very good, very good. Well, let me try it this way then. I'm an economist, right? And there are other economists in the room. And the first thing that we're going to say is that incentives matter, right? If you want to see a behavior, right, you have to incentivize it. What incentives could exist or do exist? So, in other words, might it be that we focused in on the not so positive or the not good? Because that's where the incentives lie, right? We're offering me an alternative in an incentive sense that can exist or does exist, so that I might want to change my academic focus.
Sure. So when I've discussed this idea with other people, that's a question that naturally comes up. And the first part of the question is, why are we bummers to start with? So I already mentioned activity bias. We all walk around with this desire to look at if it bleeds, it leads. That's like a natural human tendency. But in addition to that, academics live in an ecosystem that really incentivizes the negative stuff. So for example, if you look at op-eds written by sociologists in major newspapers, they tend to go to sociologists writing about social problems. So that's a huge incentive there, that our major media outlets, they're picking people who focus on the negative. So we could pick many examples of that. So my former colleague, Jess Calarco, for example, wrote about parenting during COVID. That was a problem. Ed Walker, UCLA, I read his op-ed on corporate-sponsored protests and how it distracts people from genuine social change. So we live in an ecosystem where we really love rewarding the bad stuff. And so I was mentioning this to a friend of mine, and he said, Fabio, not all is lost. There's actually incentives for positive sociology. And I'm like, well, what would those be? I'm depressed. Make me feel better. And he said, go to a bookstore, Fabio. What do you see? It's like, yeah, you do see all the social problems and, our schools are failing and that sort of thing. But you know what you also see? Self-help books. Millions of them sold every year. So there is a hunger out there to read something more positive or more uplifting, and that can be part of our system for generating knowledge. And also, I would say philanthropists also have a role in this as well, where often they give the biggest rewards. The major fellowships, the MacArthur grants and whatnot, they often go to people who study social problems, but the people who are most fortunate in society could donate and sponsor research that focuses on other topics.
But they don't.
Not currently for the most part.
And practically or functionally, how are we going to move that needle, right? Is there any actual mechanism that you think might
Absolutely
help to push that?
Yeah, so first of all, events like this matter. Because what'll happen is this will be on YouTube, and yes, click the button, click the QR code, all that stuff. But once in a while, out of the thousands of people who watch this, there will be somebody with a little bit more influence, a little bit more of a pocketbook than other people. And you'd be surprised, in my years of talking about sociology, I understand that most people will hear what I have to say and then go about their daily lives. But every so often, somebody calls me and says, how can I make a change? It could be a high school student. It could be somebody with a little bit more means. And these events are the first step towards that. Second, a little bit of academic reform. So getting into a competitive sociological journal is always hard. And the academic journal, these are single-digit acceptance rates. They're very hard to get into. But you could say, found a journal that would focus on a different topic. You could offer to teach a class in this. So like my alternative social problems with happiness in the title. And little by little, you build an audience, you build kind of a muscle memory, and then when those people grow up, they watch the YouTube video, they take your class, then 30 years later, after they become the next startup entrepreneur, then they'll come back to you and say, I remember your class. Maybe we should talk about happy things. I'll say, write the check. I'd love to.
Okay, excellent. Let me, I've got my whole class is here. So I'm teaching class for a political economist. And one of the things that they have to do is they have to write a policy brief, right? Basically, they're saying, here is a policy that needs to be reformed, or here's a policy that might even be introduced as a way to move forward. Talk to my students about a policy brief that actually pushes the needle, in that maybe they could write one about something positive, or a policy brief that could enact something positive, because that's what these future political economists will do. They will be people who will talk about policies, impact
Yeah.
over individuals. Or is this something, I mean that in the sense that, or is this something individualized, or is it something that policy can help to address, or is it something that we all have to internalize individually?
I think change would happen at both an individual level and an institutional level. So, for example, here's something that you could do as an individual without anybody's help. Now that you realize that friendship is something that will help you throughout your entire life, go make some friends. That's something that anybody could do tomorrow. You can go to church, go to your local library. There are forms of sports which are very good for making friends. So that's something the individual could do. But there are other things that could be more institutional. That'll be something that you write about in a policy brief. So for example, there's a third candidate for what I call good society science, which I didn't talk about, but if I had more time, I'd talk about, but this is a good example to introduce it and to see whether you agree with it or not, is support for young mothers and children. So I just noticed in a lot of research that one of the few interventions that seems to really help people over their life is intervening at the maternal stage. So in other words, if you improve maternal health, early childhood health, infant health, that seems to have long-lasting impacts throughout the entire life course on all kinds of outcomes. As an economist, you've probably seen people like Jim Heckman write about these sorts of articles. So that'll be an example where you can say, okay, let's review the literature and look at different forms of goodness, like income, health, happiness, well-being, see whether early childhood interventions help with those, and those could be something that could be enacted through a K-12 system, whether it be through your local public school or whether it be through a private school or a charitable institution. And that'll be a great research project to see if that approach yields something interesting.
You know, one of the things that Murphy funds is something called the State of the Nation. And for those of you who haven't seen this yet, look this up, right? stateofthenation.org. It's a Murphy-sponsored project bringing in people from all disciplines and from the political left and the political right. We had a report that came out, and one of those reports said we as Americans are a wealthy but unhappy nation. That seems to jive against, how in the world could I focus in on goodness when the two seem to be just opposed to each other, right? We're wealthy, but it seems that as we're growing increasingly wealthy, we're also growing increasingly unhappy with it.
Right. And so one interesting thing about happiness research and psychological research in general is that it is generally true that measures of economic performance do correlate with these psychological well-being measures, but there's always outliers. And the U.S. is an outlier in a lot of these studies. So maybe the first thing I would say is let's figure out why the U.S. is an outlier, right? It could be the case that as a very liberalized economy, there's a lot of ups and downs in the economy. Switch myself.
I don't think it's me.
All right, check that out. All right. But that's the first step, is to ask whether the U.S. is an outlier. It could be the case that a lot of that data is being driven by economic upheavals. So for example, you may say, well, I do enjoy making more money or having more economic success, but there's a stress to it, right? And so if the U.S. is unusually distinctive in that manner, you could then ask, well, what are the things that we could do to start fixing that? And then you get to like workplace psychology or workplace balance and these sorts of things. But when you talk about like the state of the world, it's probably good to start with a basic understanding that economic openness does seem to correlate with all these things. The U.S. is an outlier in many ways on this that can be identified, but certainly a good question for policy people to dig into.
And this leads me to something else I was thinking about. What if I, as a scientist, right, social scientist, if I don't bring that up, if I don't say it, doesn't that make me complicit in the problem itself, right? As opposed to saying, I'm just going to focus in on this good part, and I'm going to leave others to talk about this thing. Am I giving license to poverty, inequality, racism, all of these things, right? And it would seem that some might argue, and I'm not saying that you do it or
Sure.
that I do, that some would argue if I said, look, there's racism, but I'm going to put that aside, and then I'm going to talk about this stuff. That by saying I'm going to put that aside, have I not become complicit in the very thing that's inhibiting more people having this thing that I really want to focus on? Or I'm struggling. What do you think? What do we do?
General responses to that, which is, first of all, to focus on intellectual pluralism. So remember, at no point did I say we should replace the study of inequality or racism or get rid of it. It has to be an integrated part of the whole. But also on a conceptual point, I've never really bought these complicity arguments. So for example, if I go to the doctor and the doctor says, you would feel healthier if you ran for 15 minutes a day, or you just ate less and lost a little bit of weight, that would actually make you actively better. Is it correct for me to respond by saying, therefore you don't care about cancer? The doctor would say, no, I obviously care about cancer and I care about living a good life. But right now you're in front of me and you ask me to help you lead a good life, and it involves exercise. If you get cancer, call me, we can talk about it. I think social scientists are in the same position where we can say in complete honesty, look, we care about racism, we care about sexism. These are things that are empirically true. We have lots of evidence on them. But that doesn't mean that we do the reverse complicitness and then ignore all the good stuff, but just say, in the present moment, in the conversation, what is this conversation about? So if you say, I'm an inequality researcher, I want to talk about inequality, that's great. But if you say, I'm representing the discipline, then you should be a little bit more diverse in how you think. And that's completely fair.
But isn't it human nature, right, that we, as you pointed out, and I'm trying to make a bigger point about this, right, that we can tend to more readily agree on the bad than on the good. So in that regard, you listed some things and you said, look, here are some things that we could fairly much agree on that are good. I'd probably push back a little bit and say, I know for me, right, but I also know some of my colleagues, and they're just, these economists, they're a rough crowd. I don't know what to do with them, right? So
I don't know what to do with economists either.
Precisely. This is the problem.
Yeah, but when we're talking about the good and pushing back on it, I'm going to quiz you now. Is that okay, if I quiz you?
Put me to it. I'm going to defer and say I don't know it.
All right. So if money isn't good, is it okay for you to give me 10% of your paycheck since you don't need it anymore?
I didn't say that, right? So I'm absolutely, I'm with
the
you.
argument, right?
Right.
So when you're sick, do you call the doctor and say, thank God I have the flu? Thank God I can't get out of bed?
We certainly do not.
Right.
So,
There's an old joke among stand-up comics, which is people say, I never want to live to 90, but no 90-year-old ever says that, right? So I know that maybe your colleagues who are economists, who are a very special group of people, may want to argue about this. And this is why I said I'm not making an argument about the good in a Platonic sense about what the complete life is, but it's more of a pragmatic argument. Like, I have to get out and do social research. I have to justify my paycheck. I have to justify my legitimacy, my intellectual authority. And the way I can do that is by starting with the obvious rather than deny it, which is that there are these things that most humans value most of the time. And the argument doesn't go beyond that. But if you can just start with that, then you're going to have a really good conversation. Or you can start nitpicking about what is good or not good, and then the conversation will grind to a halt and have a very different direction.
by the way, my economics colleagues are great folks. So I
love them.
I was just setting that up. So last thing before we open it up, and this will probably come up, I want to let's save a little time here for some interaction with the audience here. We got a lot of young people here, right? They might not become professional PhD sociologists, political economists, engineers or whatever, right? This might be it. What do you say to the young people in the room who want to carry forth and do the good work, right? Pun intended, that you're speaking of. Would you say that you want them to go out and make friends? They seem to be addicted to just using their thumbs and messing around on their little phone things, which I would too, but I can't see it. It's too small. So I actually have to talk to humans. What would you say to this group?
Well, I think there's a lot of simple messages for young people. So, for example, we could make fun of it, but making friends is a simple and obvious thing to do. One thing that people who are a little bit longer in the tooth, so to say, know that making friends is harder in life. So in the same way that you should maintain a good diet throughout your life so you don't, have bad health, you should try to maintain good friendships throughout your life. And so even when you have the temptation to do that 40 or 50 hour or 60 hour work week, still make time for your friends. Call them back. That's like a really simple thing. Another really simple message from this is be careful of the media that you consume. And a lot of the social negativity or social problems bias comes out through our ecosystem. We talked about the incentives. This is really rewarded. So another very simple message for young people is to unplug from the system and eat a better diet of information. Yeah, there are horrible things in the world. In Israel and Gaza, it's horrible right now. In the Ukraine, it's horrible right now. But at the same side, it's not horrible in this room right now. We're blessed to be here, and that's important to learn. Then if you do have an activist spirit in your bone, or activist bone in your body, and you want to improve the world, to realize that there are many ways of doing it. So for example, I mentioned early childhood interventions is maybe another thing that is widely ranging in terms of how well it leads to good things. So that might be something you could support through donations or becoming a K through 12 teacher or something like that. Or you could also just be part of the regular economy. And instead of seeing it as kind of a drag, which it is, that's why you're paid to go to work, but to realize that you're doing it for a reason, that somebody will get a nice cell phone out of it, or their bread will be 3 cents cheaper per loaf, and that matters to a poor family. Like slightly cheaper bread, or working in a corporation helps you do that. So I think there are many things that people can do, many different paths, and I would just say, start by making some friends. I think that's a really good start.
All right, so I dominated. I thought we had a pretty good chat, but what we're going to do is we're going to open this up to the room. There are 2 people with mics, so all you have to do is raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and then they'll come to you. Let me warn you that these people never let go of the mic, so if you try to take the mic from them, they will not hand it over to you. Hands up, somebody. That's all right. This hand was up first here, and then I'll get to you. I'll get to everybody. We got plenty of time. So right here in the front, this gentleman right here. See, I told you she wasn't gonna I told you she won't let go of the mic.
I thought you were kidding.
Yeah, try it.
So thank you very much, Fabio. I find this broadly convincing, no? But I wonder if, there's a reception issue here. I mean, if you compare to, say, research in medicine, is sociological research really more negative than medical research, or is it a reception issue? I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you're an infectious disease researcher, you're like a hero, no? If you study racial bias and educational outcomes, you're like, a skunk in the garden party, no? And so I'm trying to figure out why that is. And it seems like, a lot of sort of sociological or social science research sort of has implications for a lot of people that are quite uncomfortable, that has to do with sort of their social status, their sort of socio-moral outlook, or their well-being in a way that medical research doesn't. I mean, there's lots of exceptions to this. Cancer research certainly had implications for tobacco companies and they fought back. But more broadly, sociological research, and we crash a lot of parties. It's like, you're not welcome to talk about it. And because it has such immediate implications for a lot of people. Is it really a disciplinary issue, or is it a reception issue of how our work is received?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I picked on sociology because I'm part of the tribe, and that's easy to poke fun at. I'm very open to the hypothesis that may be equally bad in other disciplines. So here's something that is true about medicine, which really illustrates also a negativity bias, and that we give the rewards to the heroes who do the really bad stuff. If you were to go to somebody and say, what are the top 3 or 4 things that would vastly improve your health and literally give you 5 to 7 extra years of life, with almost like 100% guarantee, like this works almost every time? Here are the answers. Don't smoke, don't drink, and at least do some moderate exercise. But who gets all the money? The heart surgeons, because they're fixing all these incredibly nasty, horrible problems, right? But who goes around saying, thank God my doctor told me to quit smoking. That guy deserves a raise. You never hear that, right? So people who are addiction counselors, or doctors who help people with these kinds of problems, or exercise coaches or whatnot, they do make a living, but it's definitely disproportionate to people who deal with the nastiest of problems, right? You also bring up a very important point, which is that sociologists are often in an uncomfortable position because they're pointing out stuff that people are doing badly, right? And I recently finished a handbook chapter for a forthcoming handbook on sociology and free speech and the politics of it. And one thing I point out in the chapter, email me later, I can provide you a copy, is that every society that has sociology hates sociologists because we're always tattletaling on people. And it doesn't matter. So, for example, in Western societies, we're seen as like socialist backstabbers, and socialist societies we're seen as capitalist stooges. And it's because in every society, sociologists are seen as like the tattletales who wag their fingers. And like you said, we're in the skunk in the room. We accuse other people of doing things badly. And I think that is true. And I also think that's necessary, right? So for example, if you have a really question about like, why is group number 1 of students doing well, and you find differential treatment by teachers, you have to talk about it, right? Like you just can't avoid that topic. So that's absolutely true. But at the same time, I think we sometimes over-valorize that role, right? Like for example, there was a book that was popular called Gang Leader for a Day. Remember that book? And that really embraces it. Like, I'll show you the most bad dudes in Chicago, and I did an ethnography with them, and I'm showing you all that stuff. And that guy gets on the New York Times, but nobody, writes about like, yeah, I went to a school that was completely functional and taught its kids well, and I'm here to tell you the secrets of how that works. That guy almost never gets in the New York Times bestseller list. So yes, we are the skunk in the room sometime, and we still have to keep doing it. But once again, it's about diversity and balance. We need to start adding some other stuff to the mix.
Let's try right here on the end. Yep, Plea.
Hi, I am Carla LaRoche. I am on the core faculty for the Murphy Institute, and I'm also a law professor at the law school. I have 2 different thoughts on your idea. Overall, I focus on the criminal legal system, gender, racism, and I would love to focus. Sometimes I get tired of focusing on all the bad things in all of that world. And I do have law review articles that envision, for example, being able to vote and access to civil rights for all. And so, like the prior questioner, in theory, I like the idea. I had a question about the membership data piece and how much of the change was about access for diverse people in the membership.
Sure.
So they might be more interested in that field, or in their universities or institutes in the past, they weren't seen as valid or authentic or legitimate if they did not go into those older sections, and now there's more freedom for them to actually put their money where they're actually interested in. And so that was a question I had about, we don't know what they would have done in the past if there had been more diversity, more access, and more acceptance of those topics in the past. And then a more general question, the law, I feel like we're doing the opposite of what you're saying in sociology, where we have Plessy versus Ferguson, and we elevated the court and said separate and equal was okay. And so, look, Black people have access to the bus. It doesn't matter that they have to sit in the back of it, right? And then the reason why the civil rights movement happened was because people were talking about these issues, talking about how bad they are. And I understand that you said that they're also important, but when I think about the legal decisions, the legal reforms that have come into play, part of it is the choice people have to look at particular narratives to say, but this will benefit society when they're pointing at particular aspects of society. So I'm thinking about like the somewhat recent analysis or discussions on benevolent slavery, right? We get Black people were given food and they weren't idle, right? And that would be this good society interpretation versus no, this was messed up, even worse than messed up, right? And then I think about the Farmline lawsuit in Baton Rouge currently, the trial that happened recently on prison labor and prison slavery. And one narrative is that why are these individuals in Angola complaining about working on plantations on the farms? They're able to get money to put in their commissary to pay for necessities. They're learning a skill or something like that, when really it's they're in the sun in 100-degree weather, they're not getting any water or protection, and the only reason that they stop in those situations is if the horse collapses, not if a person passes out. And so, but the narrative can be, this is important, like they need to work for their time because they broke the social contract. And so isn't it more, at least in my field, I feel like it's more dangerous to say, let's focus on the good of society because the law is political inherently.
Yeah, so you bring up multiple really important concepts. I want to address them kind of one by one. So first of all, I think the legal field, I'm not an attorney, I've never trained in law, so I'm just speaking as myself. That seems to be the field where this kind of argument would probably have the least kind of weight, because if you're in front of a lawyer, something has already gone wrong. Unless maybe you're talking about like business law, you're just regulating torts and contracts or something like that. But if you're in criminal defense, something is already happening. When I've consulted lawyers, it's usually after other forms of interaction have not worked. So basically the legal profession is doing the hard work of society in a very important way. So for somebody to roll in and say, you guys should be happy, is probably not the most fertile ground for discourse. I would just say I respect what lawyers do, and I recognize that their job is to deal with problems head on. Then you bring up a couple other issues that really deserve some in-depth reflection. So the first comment was about ASA memberships. Could it be the case that I think the way maybe an economist would say it is as there's suppressed demand. Like these are people, this is something that people wanted to study for a long while, but it wasn't valorized. And then now there's a period of time where it is valorized and people are moving into there. This data cannot distinguish between that argument and other hypotheses for where it's happening. But I will add an additional comment, which is that if there are faculty of color, including myself, who are interested in these topics, they hypothetically could sign up for, say, the poverty and inequality section, but they could also sign up for things like rational choice. They could sign up for things like demography. I will say, and this is autoethnographic, so this is just my own personal trajectory. I am a member, or was for many years, a member of the rational choice section, and I was like one of very few minorities there. So this has indicated to me over the years that a lot of the identity of faculty of color is often tied to a social problems perspective, justifiably. I don't think it's a very irrational thing to do. But at the same time, it may be, worth thinking about a different kind of identity or a different angle that both recognizes the problems you're trying to address, the historical trajectory you're on, but also different avenues of inquiry as well. And then the third comment was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm going to ask for a clarification because you said something that really got me right here that I found shocking. You said beneficent slavery? Benevolent slavery. Okay, that sounds horrifying to me. Okay, so I'm just making sure that we're on the same page, that we both recognize that's really bad. And to entertain it even as a thought experiment, it's something very dodgy. When it comes to arguments like this, I think there's actually a very intuitive response, which is that as decent human beings, we have to take the well-being of others into account. Just like stop, right there. So for example, people will say, well, Fabio, do you approve of this or that because of, the expropriation of, resources from indigenous peoples? And I'll say, no, that's not what I stand for, even though they say they're capitalist. But, usually the word capitalism is reserved for voluntary trade, not theft. This is why if I steal somebody else's car, that's not called a profit, because that's not a voluntary interaction. So when you mention these multiple examples, they are examples of people who've been dominated, forced, exploited, abused. There are many different words we could use that. And if you start with the moral calculus that says that I care about your well-being, then automatically you're in the negative zone. So in other words, when I evaluate any policy, I always have to consider both sides of the interaction, right? So I'm not familiar with the benevolent slavery argument. I hope not to become familiar with it, but if you send me an email, I will look over it. But what I would guess, because I've seen arguments like this before, but they always play a trick. They never consider the utility of the person being dominated, right? And so if you really care about people's well-being, you have to consider the well-being of everybody in the room. And so all these institutions just start off with the opposite assumption that it's okay to violate their rights, to treat them like garbage, right? And so to get away from that kind of argument, you just have to start and say, okay, so maybe somebody in this horrible situation got food and water, but the situation is so horrible that it violates any moral calculus that any of us would subscribe to. And to have a hard line on that. And I think once you do that, it starts allowing you to get to better parts of the argument, right? And the better parts of the argument are things like, okay, given a historical trajectory of abuse or exploitation, what are the institutions that do work? So I have another publication. This is in a book called Sociology, Classical Liberalism. If you're interested, it is open access from Bloomsbury. You can just download it. And I talk about race and social change. And one of the arguments I make is that people who advocate for things like this don't want to deny the horrible historical trajectories we've been on, but at the same time, we don't want to ignore things that work, right? So for example, life expectancies for all minority groups have gone up over the last 50, 100 years. If you look at census data, Black poverty rates have really dropped quite a bit. Still, there is a Black-white poverty gap, but the absolute level has gone down, and that means that millions of people are better off. I have to consider that fact. That's the stuff that I'm really interested in. I'm not very emotionally or intellectually invested in the benevolent slavery arguments of the world. Rather, those people are playing, I think, a sleight of hand with you and their readers by assuming it's okay to abuse people and not accounting for that in your moral calculus.
All right, let me do this. We have 7 minutes, and so we're going to go rapid fire. I'm going to give first priority to my students, so all students, not my students, students in this room. If you are a student, raise your hand. We're going to start right here. Short answers, short questions. Let's see how many we can do.
I was just wondering how you would respond to this. So you are focused on the positive, but it seems like your overall view of this sect of academia is negative. And, you know, when you look at this, you're saying that academia is prioritizing this negative perspective. But when I look at that list, I see a group of scholars that want to serve their community, focus on how we can improve society, which to me is inherently good.
Fabio, go.
Yeah,
Give
so,
me a fast one.
all right, fast one. You have more than one tool in your toolbox to help out. That's basically the answer. You have a big toolkit, and we're restricting and good people are restricting themselves to one play in the book. That's the quick answer.
Let's try right here. Black shirt.
That's it.
Makaru, PhD student in anthropology. Obviously, we have morals and standards. I want to believe everybody in this room would be opposed to the benevolent slavery argument. However, given the current trend in society and the government to try to whitewash history and prevent museums from exhibiting Black history and portrayals of slavery and so on and so forth, it seems very clear to me that there's a sector of society that's definitely does not have a problem with that and has the power. So is there a danger that by giving room, let's say hypothetically speaking, in the future, 50% of sociology is about the negative, and 50% is about the positive. There might be people in a position of power that might say like, oh, we should only be doing happy sociology, and let's not have this thing here that's a bunch of communists and people who make me feel uncomfortable for being white and so on and so forth. Is there a danger that by opening the space for good sociology, we might be unleashing a Pandora's box that might give people in a position of power the ability to interfere with actual academic freedom?
Yeah, by the way, I'm very sensitive to this whole issue of whitewashing history because the state of Florida had my own book booted from the AP Black Studies curriculum a couple of years ago. So I was directly affected by that. If you go back to Twitter and some news articles, you could see that. So I'm very sensitive to that. But here's my response to that. So first of all, one of the primary values of any scholar should be accuracy. And by simply trying to have a more balanced portfolio of what we talk about, somehow enables the bad people, I would just say, so be it. You know, the same way that a doctor could say, you might not like the message I have for you, but here it is. But then in terms of actual politics and what I think would happen if we went down the road that I suggest, I would say we already tried the other way. And by being like really negative all the time, it's very easy for the folks on that side of politics to use us as a punching bag. Why should you listen to these people? They always say the same thing. You know, and they're ignoring some very obvious things that are true, right? And for people who don't know any better, that's a very easy argument to buy. Instead, if you could just say, look, what they're saying is factually false. We don't say the same things all the time. We are the skunk in the room occasionally. We'll call you out on it. But also, if we think something is going well, we'll document that and study that well as part of our scientific project. And those guys are wrong to paint us in that light. That's a way easier argument to make if we actually do it.
All right. I saw a student over here. There we are right here. And we've got, 3 minutes, so.
Yeah.
So two things. One, I was a history teacher in Florida, so I do feel your pain because I had to get rid of all my class from the library right around then. And of course, due to that, I ended up starting a PhD program here at Tulane. My question is, a lot of departments are very, not strict, but they really do focus on some problems. How do you justify it? So I work with
Local government, and I want to study why some cities work and some don't. How do I convince them that this is something worth doing to say, I'm going to look at a city that does not have these problems? why does this city have these problems and this city does not? For example, New Orleans just had a pipe burst. They gave us all boil water advisory. That pipe was put in 1908. They had not replaced it in over 118 years. Other cities don't have that problem. Well, how can I justify to a committee why I need to study other cities that actually function?
Well, the hour and 1 minute and 50 seconds left. I'll totally solve it for you. But, you know, there has to be some level of interest in the truth from the people you're talking to. So if you happen to be in a city where people just aren't interested in maintenance at all, or cost savings or effectiveness, it doesn't really matter what you say. And I'm not going to pretend that it does. But on the margin, there will be cities, or there could be one council member who wouldn't be interested in like what is functional. Another candidate, you know, for good society sociology might be good neighborhoods. You know, how many of us feel good in life because we grew up in a nice place, right? We weren't subject to crime and these sorts of things. And so for people who are interested in those things, this will be a good starting point to say, I have a set of tools and a framework and a theory for kind of what works in life. And if you're willing to listen, you'll have happier residents, more tax revenue, and so forth. I think got one left.
All right, we got 50 seconds. This seems like one of those radio shows. 50 seconds, go.
I can just.
She's not letting you go with that mic, man.
Yeah, I'm a chess student. So before I was before I chose to be a philosopher, I was in the educational psychology department, and some people they share their how disappointed for quantitative researchers obsessive to statistically significant result. So all of them they try to make their results statistically significant. That's the only way for them to publish papers. And this could lead to some ignorance. Because they feel like if you have a good reason to think for a research, the result should be significant result. But it turns out that they are not they are not statistically significant. There must be something interesting there, but they just choose to give up it because they cannot publish papers for that. So I think the answer is not just about this ignorance there, it's more about the way those researchers thinking. There's some wrongness here. Like people need to think about how should they do research. I feel just maybe a parallel here when it comes to your topic. It's not just about there's an imbalance here, or we should do something positive. It's more about there's a worry about like there might be something wrong here. Like why when people do their research, they just go to that direction. Yeah, that's just my worry. Yeah.
What are some cases?
All these results are P equals 5 or less, so you're good to go on the significance.
Look, I got good and bad news for you. So the good news is that he's not going anywhere, so that those of you who still have questions, I'm sorry we couldn't address them in this open forum, but he's going to be right here. You can come up and talk to him. The bad news is it's time for us to wrap this up. But before we do that, first off, I want you to join me in thanking Fabio for coming to the really engaging work. And the last thing that I always want to do is to let you know that I didn't put this together. The staff did this, and so I want to have the staff be recognized. Are any of our staff members outside? So there's one of our staff members. There's one behind it, one outside. Let's always thank the Murphy staff who put these things together. In 1 month's time, we will be having a huge conference on AI. What's the title of the AI event that's coming up?
From code to consequences.
From code to consequences, AI. So please join us again for our next Murphy event. So thank you all for coming out. Appreciate you.
Thank you.